Hi to everyone who's joining us for the Faith Always Wins Interfaith panel. We are presenting Leaning on Our Faith for Hope and Inspiration tonight. And as more people start entering, I'm going to watch my clock and just give people just a few more minutes. But earlier today, I pulled our registration, and at the time I pulled our registration, we had 120 people registered. And so I wanted to show you what the 120 people looked like. Now, as you're entering right now, about 20 minutes before we started, we actually had 137 people registered. This is what we looked like before when we had 120. And then interestingly enough, we had a few more people register who named themselves as Abrahamic. They identify as Abrahamic. And then someone said they are constantly shifting. And we have a Scientologist who's supposed to be joining us, and a Seventh-day Adventist, and also someone from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and a Zen Buddhist. So we have a lot of variation of faith identities and non-faith joining us, so welcome. I just thought it would be fun to show you how diverse our group is on the Zoom call tonight. So I went a little further. You all were asked to tell me how you identified your gender. And I did have a few people who didn't want to tell me their gender, and that's totally fine. And but here you are as male and female. And so the females earlier this afternoon were overwhelming the male. I don't know what it's going to end up being when I look at it after we're finished. And then the other thing I wanted to show us is representing our decades. Everyone is really representing. We've got some teens on all the way to our 80s, and then a few people who are just not telling us their age, which is totally fine. But in case you were a person who didn't want to tell us your age, this is what we were doing it for. You can see that our 60s, people in the 60s had the majority of people attending, and then but quite a few in 50s and 60s. And I'm really proud of teens, 20s, and 30s for showing up. We actually have two young people also who will be facilitating. And we also have someone in our younger generation who is a panelist today as well. So I'm going to continue so that we can move on to the presentation. So sponsors are welcome, and this is where your name could be. But tonight we don't have any sponsors. So I didn't actually go out and try to solicit any sponsors. I thought we would just host this from Faith Always Wins, which we're doing, but let you all know in attendance if you or your business wants to be a sponsor. I want to be a sponsor when we do this in the winter. We're expecting to do this again in February. You can let me know and we can arrange for your name to be right there. Okay, so today marks the beginning of Faith Always Wins 30 Days of Kindness. So Faith Always Wins in 7 days are hosting our own 30 Days of Kindness. Several churches in our community of Kansas City have done that. And I know a friend of mine, Dr. Michelle Robin is hosting 31 Days of Kindness. So we're also doing that. If you follow our social media feeds, you will see at one action of kindness a day. And our action is to make you all aware that we are cultivating kindness. We have a special campaign going on. We're just looking to raise $5,000 for people who we realize face hate, and we want to maybe give them a gift basket or flowers or something like that. Our themed t-shirts, just to let them know that they are welcome in Kansas City. You all may be aware that earlier this year that someone was really not treated well when they moved into the community, and we wanted to do something for not only that family, but other families. Faith Always Wins does operate year-round, and we have 42 monthly donors. I wanted to point that out. We also appreciate any one-time donations, and you also can purchase our themed paraphernalia. We have themed t-shirts that are available on the 7 Days website. So we're going to start moving into the panel, and I am going to introduce our moderator. I'm very happy to introduce Bill Tammeus, who I call a friend. And here's a little bit about Bill for you to look at. But Bill and I were introduced in 2015 by John Willis, who at the time was the president CEO of Kansas City Interfaith Youth Alliance. And we had a relationship with that organization. And John introduced me to Bill. And Bill has interviewed me on several occasions. And then I had the pleasure of interviewing Bill this year on my own podcast. What's exciting, many of you know Bill, and he may be the reason that you're on tonight. I just want to make sure and point out that Love, Loss, and Endurance, a 9/11 story of resilience and hope in an age of anxiety is being published, and it comes out on January 19th. So I'm going to welcome Bill, who's very knowledgeable, and we're so delighted that he volunteered his time to be our moderator. I also might recommend that if you want to really focus on who's speaking, you can change your gallery view to be looking at the speaker only. And that way, when someone is speaking, their picture will be the only one that comes up. But if you want to look at everybody, that's fine too. So Bill, thank you so much for helping us, and I'm going to pass it on to you.
Thank you, Mindy, and good evening, everyone. Friends, we are at near the end of a very traumatic year. In fact, you know, if this year had been an automobile, it would have been recalled months and months ago. Given that, the question for all of us tonight is how we might draw from the wisdom and insights of some of the world's great religious traditions and spiritual paths to get us through to the end of 2020 in hope, and into 2021 with generative anticipation. Well, fear not. We have some help with that tonight from 4 panelists representing 4 different faith traditions. And when I say they are representing those traditions, I do not mean that they are speaking for those traditions. Given the diversity of adherents within each religion or tradition, it would be impossible for one person to represent everyone. So please keep that in mind. So the question is, who's here? Who's on the panel? First, I would like you to know Dr. Joshua Paszkiewicz. He will be representing Buddhism tonight. He has been teaching full-time as a Zen priest since 2010. He has degrees in liberal studies in religion and a doctor of ministry in pastoral psychotherapy. He's board certified as both a pastoral counselor and a clinical chaplain. Next, the Reverend Dr. Emanuel Cleaver III, who will be representing Christianity. Emanuel is senior pastor at St. James United Methodist Church in Kansas City. He's a graduate of Philander Smith College and holds a Master of Divinity degree from Methodist Theological Seminary, as well as a D.Min or Doctor of Ministry from St. Paul School of Theology here in Kansas City. Next is Zoya Khan, who will be representing Islam. Zoya is a third-year law student at Brooklyn Law School. She has been actively involved in interfaith work for a number of years. She's a graduate of the University of Kansas, and while there, she was active in the Muslim Student Association, the Student Senate, and Students for Refugees. Our 4th panelist is Rabbi Sarah Smiley, who will be representing Judaism. She's a pulpit rabbi with the Temple Congregation B'nai Yehuda in the Kansas City area. She's a graduate of Indiana University and was ordained at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. She spent time as a rabbi in New Jersey and was director of religious life at the Ohio State University, Hillel. So I'm going to begin throwing some questions at our panelists. And I would like to actually begin with Zoya because her first name begins with Z, and people with Z names almost never get asked first. So let me start there. Zoya, I wonder if you would tackle this first question, which is this. At a time when America as a nation is so polarized over matters of politics, of race, economics, and other matters, what can you share from your faith tradition that can help all of us come together as the United States?
Lovely. First of all, I want to thank you, Bill, for moderating this event, and for Mindy and 7-Day for organizing this. We're really grateful for this opportunity. When it comes to the idea of understanding ourselves as a nation, it's important to know that no matter what ups and downs we go through, that we have to check in with ourselves. And that's one thing that Islam really focuses on, is our personal relationship with God. And that requires us to be reflective and to know where our heart is, where our soul is. But with being introspective and reflecting on our own relationship with God, that also requires us to understand one another on a very personal and deep level. When we look, as Muslims, when we look for, right, the ideal person who lived out his faith, we look to our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And one thing he says is, none of us can truly live our faith until we love for our brother what we love for ourselves, right? And so that means that we don't know what our brother needs, what our brother or sister in humanity needs, unless we truly know them. And so I think one thing that we forget easily is we get caught up in our perception of others. And Islam really, really encourages us to remember that at our core is where we best understand a person, right? When we understand someone's perspective, their experience, and what has shaped them as a person.
Thank you. Emanuel Cleaver, I wonder if you would take that same question. What from your faith tradition can help us come together as a people?
Well, the first thing actually comes out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, going back to the Old Testament of the Bible in the book of Genesis. At the very beginning, it says that we were male and female created in the image of God. And if we would take a moment to look at others, even those who disagree with us, that this person was created in God's image. It doesn't say that Democrats or Republicans, conservatives or progressives, but male and female, we were all created in God's image. And if we took that approach, we just might treat one another with a little more respect and dignity.
Okay, thank you. Rabbi Sarah, I wonder if you would, from your perspective, say a little about this question of how we come together as a people.
Yeah, so I also would agree with what Emanuel Cleaver just said about the idea of each individual being created. In Hebrew, we say B'Tselem Elohim, created in the image of God, from that same text that he just talked about. But there's one other text that also jumps out to me with this question, and it's the section of Torah that in Judaism we call the Holiness Code. And it is a section that is so important that is actually the Yom Kippur, one of the most holiest days on our calendar, afternoon Torah reading. It comes from Leviticus chapter 19. And in this holiness code, it tells us that we should be holy because we are trying to be godlike, whatever that means for us. And in it, it tells us ways to be holy. And many of those ways include how we treat not just our own community, but how we treat the people who are different than us. Throughout the text, it says that we're supposed to look out for the widow, the stranger, the orphan. That's a motif throughout Torah that's repeated so many times. And I think that so many of our divisions in our world today is because, just like it's been said, we don't look at each other that are different than us the same as we look at the people who are like us. So I think we just need to remember both this idea of B'Tselem Elohim, being created in the image of God. All of us, no matter what we believe, are created in the image of God, but also that there are texts that teach us how to live that, how to be holy. And that includes taking care of not just us, but others. And if we're able to do that, then maybe we'll be able to celebrate the differences to bring us together rather than using them to tear us apart.
Thank you. I want to stay with you for just a minute, Sarah. It's interesting to me that faiths draw from one another. Christianity grew out of Judaism. Uh, uh, Muslims are supposed to know the Bible because in the Quran there are references to biblical stories that you can't understand if you don't know the Bible. Is it? My understanding is that the Holiness Code, at least some of it, was drawn from Canaanite, the Canaanite people who were there before Jews came into the Holy Land. Is that true?
A lot of our texts have so much in common, like you said, and a lot of us, although we interpret the text differently, read the exact same text. And a lot of those stories don't necessarily come from one tradition. So yes, they come from outside traditions that weave different interpretations of them, which is one of the things I love about interfaith work, the ability to look at the exact same text and possibly have different interpretations of it that might lead us to the exact same answer, even though we're interpreting it in a very different way, which I think is a lesson for how we can live our lives also. If we're able to do that with our text, why can't we do that with our lives?
Yeah, thank you. Joshua Paszkiewicz, I wonder whether from a Buddhist perspective, you would tackle this question of how we come together as a people.
Yeah, sure. You know, one of the things I most appreciate about Buddhism is we're kind of light on philosophy or theology, if you will, and pretty heavy on instructions and practices and things that we should do. One of the things that's most important in the life of a Buddhist is the capacity to pause, to step back and to assess reality from a more objective standpoint than our initial assertions might place us in. You know, I think we see each other with these initial impressions so often as being diametrically opposed in some form of disunity rather than being intrinsically connected in the way that Buddhist philosophy does postulate that we are. So from a Buddhist perspective, having the capacity to survey our reality, to take a step back from making so many assumptions that separate us and to be able to settle down into the space where we actually are and realize the okayness that exists moment after moment in that place that allows us to then center ourselves, reassess, and move back into the world with a sense of equanimity and hopefully with compassion that we build through meditative pausing practice.
As you do that, how important is some kind of ritual that moves you to that space? What Buddhist ritual is involved here in getting there?
I would say, interestingly enough, the capacity for consistency. We have a number of rituals depending on the schools of Buddhism. You know, I sometimes joke that we look at Christianity with all of its denominations present in the US. Buddhism has had 500 years longer to splinter and create denominations and practices, and we've done it quite well. So to pinpoint what practices or liturgical sort of observances can preface that capacity to pause would be difficult. But what you'll find common amongst them is making sure you're doing so consistently. So it's not just enough to be perturbed one day and say, oh, I need to practice this settling down and building compassion and finding equanimity and interconnection with my neighbor. It's to say, no, this needs to be the focal point of my life and my daily work as a Buddhist practitioner.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move on to another question. Emanuel Cleaver, I'd like to start with you on this one. Every religious tradition makes claims that are unique to itself about what is true and what isn't. The question is, how do we reconcile that reality with a call to love neighbor? How do we genuinely engage in dialogue when these unique claims are part of our traditions?
Well, I mean, I would say, you know, we don't have to agree. We don't even agree within our own traditions. Even within the Methodist tradition of the Christian tradition, we don't agree. But I would point out just two stories. One is in the book of Genesis, where it says, I think it's in chapter 11 of book of Genesis, where they're building the Tower of Babel. God comes down and destroys it and confuses the language. And we often look at that as the people spread out throughout the earth. that was an example of God creating diversity. And if God created diversity, then it ought to be celebrated. There's another story in the New Testament, the book of Revelation, where there is this heavenly scene where it says people from every nation, every tribe, every language came together. And it was sort of this mass worship celebration. So there are instances within the Christian tradition that suggest that we ought to celebrate diversity. We often think if people thought like me, then the world would be better. But in all actuality, if everyone had the same thought, looked at the world the same as me, it'd be a pretty boring place. As much as I hate to admit that, if everyone thought like me, it'd be pretty boring. So, I mean, I do truly believe that God created diversity. And if it's something that was God created, we ought to honor it and celebrate it. We should not ignore it. Say, I don't see race. Well, I want you to see race because it's something that we ought to celebrate, the various races, cultures, traditions.
And yet my guess is, Emanuel, that there are some claims that we Christians, I'm one as well, that we make that you would not abandon, you would not give up for the sake of simply getting along.
No, I mean, there are some principles, I would call them the necessities, I guess, of the Christian tradition that I would always hold on to. But it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has to, especially from other religious traditions. As you look at the story of Jesus, he never forced anyone to believe what he believed.
Great. Zoya, I wonder whether you would tackle the same question of every religious tradition makes unique claims, and given that, how do we enter into dialogue with each other given those claims? Go ahead.
Sorry. I think what Reverend Cleaver said is exactly on point. So in Islam, we believe the Quran to be the divine word of God. And God says very clearly that we made you into nations and tribes so you may get to know one another, right? You hear this referenced a lot by Muslims when we are having any sort of dialogue about building community. Because as Muslims, we believe that the way the world was made, our cultures, our nations, our traditions, our race, whatever it may be, is divinely decreed. And and because of that divine decree, we have a responsibility to lean into those differences. It is very convenient to only focus on the similarities, which is important in building bridges, but without understanding why we are unique, it becomes, in my opinion, a little bit non-productive. Because by better knowing what makes us unique, what makes us different, we better understand one another, and then we also better understand ourselves.
In the Quran, it also says that there is no compulsion in religion. You can't compel someone to be a follower. And yet we know that in every single religious tradition, there have been those who have wanted to compel, who have wanted to be rigid in their theology. And I guess the follow-up question is, how do we deal with those folks?
One thing that we say in our community is that, right, our religion is perfect, Muslims are not. So as individuals, we ought to do our best to abide by what God has set forth for us. But more often than not, we make a few mistakes here or there. Great.
Rabbi Sarah, I wonder whether you would take a go at that same question. And while you do that, is there something about Judaism, something in Judaism that you would cling to no matter what, even if you are in conflict with other traditions?
So the first thing that comes to mind for me when we talk about disagreements is that there's actually a teaching in Judaism that tells us that we should disagree. There is this idea that when you study a text in Judaism, you're supposed to study in chavruta, which means in partnership with somebody else. And you're not supposed to agree with your partner. You're supposed to argue with them. And that's the best way that you study. And when you study in that way, Judaism says that's when God's presence comes into that relationship with study. And so there's this idea about the different ways to disagree with people. And one of them, just to throw a little Hebrew out there real quick, is this idea called machloket l'shem shamayim, which basically translates to disagreements for the sake of heaven. And this idea teaches us that we're supposed to argue, and that the arguments should be l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven. Not all arguments are, but the goal is to figure out how to do that. And we learn this importance of arguing even in the codified text in the Jewish tradition. So the Talmud, which is basically the law code of Judaism, even in the Talmud, the dissenting viewpoint is shared. So you get the majority opinion of the sages written out in this text, but the minority opinion is also shared. And although the way we do the ritual, the way the law is in Judaism, typically it goes to the majority, I think it teaches us the fact that the minority opinion was recorded, that it can teach us for generations later that other people thought differently. And I just think that process of learning for me is so important to teach me the way I should disagree with people today. I don't have to agree with them, but I have to do it in a way where hopefully my argument is l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven. And this idea of debating, it talks about how do you debate an issue without attacking the person? How do you argue to solve a problem, not necessarily for yourself to win? How do you listen with the ability to admit if you're wrong, if you need to admit that you're wrong? And also the fact that if the sages were allowed to record this dissenting opinion, then so much the more so should we be able to record the other person's opinion that is different than ours. And then you also asked about, is there something in Judaism that I personally would not give up? And I think one of the things that makes Judaism different than some of our Christian neighbors is that our belief in Jesus. Jesus was a historical figure. I believe that Jesus existed, but my belief in Jesus' connection to God is very different than our Christian neighbors. And for me, that's something that I won't give up for myself, but that doesn't mean other people can't have a different belief of the same figure.
Let me go to the Talmud for just a minute. A rabbi once told me that the Talmud is 3,000 pages of unresolved debate. and the lesson there is that don't ever think that you have the final answer. Is that a fair description of the Talmud, however brief?
I would love to have been a fly on the wall of the room of the conversations that were happening that got recorded into what we call the Talmud today. Imagine a group of male rabbis sitting together and talking about what's happening and how to figure out to celebrate their Judaism in a way that is different, because it's the beginning of rabbinic Judaism. After the temple was destroyed, they had to figure out how to connect to Judaism when they no longer had a place to make sacrifices. So what I wouldn't give to be a fly on the wall to those conversations. And even today, it's still being reinterpreted. There are modern interpretations of an ancient text. And the different way people celebrate their Judaism also depends on the way people view the Talmud in itself. So me as a Reformed Jew views the Talmud as an evolving text of a way that I can learn with it and grapple with it and figure out how to bring those rituals and conversations into my lives. Whereas someone who looks at the Talmud differently could look at it a different way. So I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in those conversations of years of history coming together to teach us how to be Jewish.
Yeah, in some ways you can be a fly on the wall by reading the Talmud and the arguments there. Yeah, interesting. Joshua, I wonder whether from a Buddhist perspective, you would talk a little about the unique claims that various traditions offer and how we can dialogue honestly given those.
Sure. Well, kind of like Rabbi Sarah was saying, most Buddhist traditions have a very strong history and culture of vigorous debate within monastic institutions, especially between teacher and student, whether they're lay or ordained. In fact, in the Zen tradition, which I hail from, that's the central piece of spiritual formation between a cleric and a layperson, is this sort of examining the issues through the lens of dialogue and dissension even. But that said, it seems like the question is pointed towards some of the more metaphorical and perhaps metaphysical claims that religion tends to make. And Buddhism certainly has a host of those. However, one thing I've always appreciated, and this comes from such luminaries as His Holiness the Dalai Lama, that Buddhists are prone to accepting observational reality. So specifically, the scientific method is prized. You know, His Holiness the Dalai Lama is famed for saying, when Buddhism and science conflict, well, Buddhism has to change. And I think that that's a somewhat unique attitude from a world religions perspective that Buddhists tend to adopt. So when we see our metaphysical assertions being shot down by observational science, then maybe we say, you know, this 3-tiered universe thing or 9-tiered universe thing, maybe that's a metaphor, and maybe we can relate to that differently, and maybe now we have something else to debate and dialogue about internally.
Is that in effect sort of what's happening with the reality that this Dalai Lama has said there won't be a Dalai Lama afterwards? Is that an adaptation of example of that?
Yeah, I think it's an adaptation in so much as he's calling into question unquestioned dogma from, 1,000 years. He's looking at the political landscape, the reality that his office was essentially at one time a theocratic kingship, and saying that maybe that doesn't have a place in the modern world as he's been in dialogue with it. And that maybe seeking to preserve that dogma and assume that there's a reincarnated being that takes that office as a continuation of his life force isn't in the best, isn't the best use of his spiritual authority for the peace among peoples and even nations in his case.
Interesting. Thank you. I've got another question here, and I'm going to ask Zoya to start this one. Zoya, what do you find most beautiful about a religious tradition other than your own, and how did you learn it?
So I actually attended Catholic school for the majority of my life. For folks who know Sion, Notre Dame de Sion, one core aspect of that school, which I was really grateful for, was their focus on interfaith, learning, dialogue, experiences, things of that sort. And so throughout my time, middle, high school, we had several opportunities to visit places of worship, visit with religious leaders, engage in dialogue. And one thing that I learned that always stuck with me, and Rabbi, correct me if I'm wrong, but when we studied Yom Kippur, I remember a very strong emphasis on asking for forgiveness from others. And that's something that is also very important in Islam. But when I learned more about the tradition of reaching out to individuals, I found that so powerful, because as people, it's easy to make a mistake and let our ego get in the way of trying to reconcile with that person that you have wronged. A core belief in Judaism and in Islam is that, you can seek forgiveness from God, and God can forgive you and, will forgive you. But if you wrong a person, you can only seek forgiveness from that person. You can only right the wrong with that person. And so that's something that's always stuck with me from my time. Yeah. In high school.
How do you put that into practice, Zoya?
I think it comes back to what I said early on, that, Islam really centers our relationship with God, which means that it requires us to reflect a lot and reflect often. And part of that reflection has to be, what did I do today and what could I have done better? And if that doesn't involve you reflecting on your interactions with human beings, then we definitely need to take a step back.
Yeah, good. Emanuel, would you like to weigh in on this about what you find most beautiful about another tradition, and how did you learn about that?
So several years ago, it was actually shortly after 9/11, and the Institute for Interfaith Dialogue was leading Christians over in Turkey to sort of build Muslim-Christian relationships. and spent, I think, 12 days in Turkey. And one thing that fascinated me was the call for prayer from the minarets 5 times a day. And it was like, regardless of where we were or what we were doing, our hosts would stop and have prayer 5 times a day. And, you know, Christians don't necessarily have a set number of times we're supposed to pray. But after so many days there and our hosts are praying, I'm like, well, I guess we ought to pray too. It's actually something I brought back. So I've, you know, haven't gotten up to 5 times, but going to the Jewish tradition of praying 3 times a day, every single day. But that was something that I really appreciated when I learned that over in Turkey from Islam.
Right after 9/11, I was in Saudi Arabia the next year to be writing some stories about Islam, and was in the marketplace in Jeddah when the call to prayer came, and the fronts of the stores all shut down, and there we were. And so exactly that, I said, why don't I use this as a time for that? We can learn from one another in that way. Yeah. Rabbi Sarah, would you tackle that same question of what you've learned beautiful from another religion?
Yeah, I would love to share 2 things with everyone. One of them is just an experience I got to have. So I lived in Israel, in Jerusalem, between the year 2005 to 2006. And while I was there, I tried to immerse myself in as much of Israel as possible, not just Jewish culture. And I chose to walk into the old city of the walled city and went to the Christian quarter on Christmas Eve and experienced midnight mass at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And the opportunity to just sit there and experience the grandeur that was happening in front of me in that space was amazing. Much of it was done in Latin, so I did not understand necessarily what was happening around me, but just the experience to be welcomed into that space and to sit there with everyone was amazing. So that is one thing that I will always remember, an experience that I got to have outside my faith tradition. And another one comes more from something I learned. So my husband, who happens to also be a rabbi, had the opportunity here to take a group of teens from Bnei Yehuda to the Islamic Center of Johnson County for them to learn together. And when he got home, he told me all about it. And one of the things that stuck out to me that he told me was the way they explained how, when the men came into prayer, how they set up. And the way he explained it to me is that they learned that the first person who got there stood in the first spot. And the next person that came in stood shoulder to shoulder next to him. And the next person that came in stood shoulder to shoulder next to him. And you just kind of lined up that way. And where you set yourself up to prayer was completely dependent on when you walked through the door. And I just thought that was so beautiful. It didn't matter if you were the front row people or the back row people or the people that always had to sit together. When you walked in for prayer, everyone was the same and they just lined up in a certain order. And I just thought that was such a beautiful lesson to learn about how we bring ourselves to prayer.
Yeah, I like that. Thank you. Joshua, you want to take a crack at the question of what you've learned from another tradition and how you've come to appreciate that?
Well, I think I have to join in our appreciation for Islam this evening. I was actually working in India in 2012, 2013, and got really sick and needed some medical attention, and found myself in United Arab Emirates, specifically Dubai and Abu Dhabi, and found that I had a remarkable dearth of knowledge about Islam. And that's something I wanted to sort of explore and plumb while I was there. And what really struck me was the praxis and pragmatism built into the 5 pillars. Some folks have already talked about that consistency of praying 5 times a day. And I talked about consistency in Buddhism, but I have a real hard time getting folks to meditate for 10 or 15 minutes twice a day, let alone pausing everything you're doing for 15 minutes or whatever, 5 times a day. But one of the things I really appreciated was I was actually there during the month of Ramadan, which of course is a time when everybody's fasting. And UAE, being an Islamic collection of emirates, follows some pretty strict codes, legal codes related to how that's lived out. And I remember that nobody was allowed to eat or drink during the day. Restaurants weren't open. But I encountered a pregnant woman eating and drinking outside. And I had to inquire to my host as to how that was going on during Ramadan. And there's that pragmatic piece that it's like, well, we understand that life and biology and the rhythms that we all have to tend to are different, and there's space built into Islam for that. The same thing with making the pilgrimage to Mecca, as it was explained to me, that that's required if you can afford it, if you can take care of your family, if it's practical, it's desirable. And so I think that's something that I really appreciate, is not just the sense of praxis that's built into the 5 pillars, but the overarching theme of pragmatism that seems to be lacking a lot from how we as Americans tend to approach religion.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned India. You probably don't know this about me, but I lived 2 years of my boyhood in India. My dad was part of a University of Illinois ag team there. And one of the, I was obviously surrounded by Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs and Jains and so on. But one of the holidays, Hindu holidays, called Holi, H-O-L-I, in which you throw colored water all over each other and squirt it at you. And it's just joy abandon. And in a tradition I come from, the Presbyterian Church, where we call ourselves, with some humor, the frozen chosen, we could use some of that sense of joy and that I saw at the holy holiday. So, yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to kind of flip that question now and ask, and I will start with Sarah this time. I will ask, what do you find most difficult or frustrating about your own tradition? And if you could, what would you change about it?
So in Judaism, like in many of our faiths, there are different ways to celebrate your faith. So although Judaism all started out in the same way and we all look to the same texts, since the development of denominations in Judaism, there are lots of different ways to interpret the rituals and how you live your Jewish life. And so for me, one of the things I find frustrating in Judaism is that there are some Jews who believe that their way they practice Judaism is the right way. I think that there is enough anti-Semitism in the world coming from the outside towards us that we don't need to be fighting from within. And yes, we practice and celebrate our Judaism differently, but wouldn't it be great if there's a way that although we disagree, we can still all get along? I think that there are Jews who interpret the text in a way that wouldn't see me as a woman or any of my female identifying colleagues as rabbis. And then there are others, Jews who practice like me, who see that the Jews who practice in a different way, they also talk down upon them. And I find that a lot inside Judaism, and that's what's very frustrating to me. I don't know how I can change that. I think I can't make other people believe what I believe. And I can't make other people celebrate their Judaism in the same way that I do. And neither do I think I should. I think the joy is that there are so many different ways for people to find connection to Judaism. My hope would be that no matter how one finds connection to their Judaism, that they realize it's okay for someone to practice it differently. And I don't think that always happens amongst all of the people. And like I said, there's enough hate coming from the outside that I would hope that we would be united from the inside.
I feel almost obligated to recommend a book to you that I'm reviewing on my blog this weekend. It's called Turning Back by Michael Lesher. And he is a Jew who did not grow up Orthodox, but Orthodoxy found him, as he puts it. And yet, although the Orthodox would even describe themselves as the strictest branch of Judaism, he struggles with all the questions and leaves room for debate. So that's a model of Orthodox that you might appreciate. And so I recommend that to you. Zoya, would you like to take the question of what you find most difficult or frustrating about Islam and what you could change, what you would change if you could?
Sure. I think one thing that I reflect on a lot as a Muslim is that we believe as Muslims, right, that the Quran, our holy book, is the word of God, is the direct word of God. And that Islam, as a result, is also a way of life. It's a way of framing every relationship in our life. It's a way of building our day, building our careers, whatever it may be, is guided by our faith. And so, like I said earlier, as a Muslim, I believe that, right, the divine decree, the word of God, is perfect. But Muslims, on the other hand, we have a lot of work to do. And because Muslims are, right, globally 1.8 billion people, there's a lot of diversity and a lot of different opinions and experiences. And one thing that I definitely look forward to, Muslims working on is, right, building that understanding between one another as well. And so as Muslims, like any other community, we have our difficulties, we have our struggles, but understanding that, like God says, he made us into nations and tribes for a reason, that we may get to know one another better, that as a Muslim, that's our obligation to come back to those basics, those core beliefs that sometimes get lost in the mess of politics and nations, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I had a follow question for you, and to prove we're on live tonight, I just went out of my head, so I may get back to that one.
Sure.
Emanuel, would you like to say something about what you find most frustrating about your tradition and what you would change? Dr. Cleaver, you're up. There you go.
I would echo a lot of what's been said already, that Christian tradition who deem other Christians not really Christian. And I would just say, for the most part, we in what I call the non-essentials, where we have a lot of disagreement. And for example, such as women in ministry, or how worship happens. But there are some within the tradition who, I guess, are the Christian police and declare who is really living out Christianity the way it's supposed to be lived out. And so that is frustrating at times, because regardless of what they think, we're still praying to the same God, following the same Jesus. So it does cause me to be frustrated at times.
Is that, if I could follow up a little, is that what's happening in the United Methodist Church today, which is on the edge of, for those of you who don't know, the United Methodist Church is on the edge of schism over basically the question of how you interpret what the Bible says, if anything, about the LGBTQ community. Do you unpack that a little bit?
Yes. So if the pandemic hadn't hit, we probably would have split. We were scheduled to meet, I think, in May in Minnesota, the Worldwide United Methodist Church. But it is over the issue of the LGBTQIA. We actually came up with a plan in 2016. We meet every 4 years, where everyone could practice what they believe, and we'd still remain in the same church. But it goes to what I said earlier. Some did not want to be a part of a denomination unless everyone practiced the same thing that they practiced. We are on the verge. We'll meet in 2021, and more than likely there will be a split.
In the Presbyterian Church, we made that change in our rules in 2011 to allow ordination of gays and lesbians and to let pastors do same-sex weddings. And though there was not a formal split, we have lost a number of congregations have left our denomination over that. So there's lots to fight about, I guess. Joshua, you get that same question out of Buddhism of what you find most difficult in it and what you would change if you were the Buddhist king.
Aspirational vocational title, Bill. Yeah, if only I were in charge. You know, Buddhism, it had its genesis in an itinerant mendicant tradition. Originally, everybody that practiced Buddhism was a monk. They were renunciates. That has led to what I would identify as rampant clericalism in Buddhism. And I think it's a huge problem. You know, Buddhists don't make the news frequently, but when we do, of recent, there's been a lot of sexual abuse things that have gone on with high profile teachers. And this comes from this clericalism where the teacher, the clergy person, is looked at as somehow more enlightened, more capable of being more awakened, more wise in an immovable sort of sense than the average follower. And that's extremely problematic, and it doesn't mesh with our doctrine. So I would have to say I would change that. How to change that? You know, I'm not so sure. We certainly need to develop a bigger appreciation for the various modes of life that people practice within and their legitimacy and really our shared humanity, and that nobody's getting to some demigod-like state through this practice, but we can increasingly cultivate wisdom and continually clarify our positions. So that would be my idea.
Okay, good, thank you. One more question for each of you, and I will start with Sarah this time. Did your religion influence not just the way you voted last week, but how you approach politics generally?
I would say that the way I choose to practice my religion influences the way that I voted actually a few weeks ago, because I dropped my little mail-in ballot in the box. Yeah. I think it has to do with the way, so I live my life through the Jewish values that I find are important for our modern day times. And I think that's how I pick which political issues are important to me as well. So I do think that Judaism influences my political beliefs, but I think it's more so in my way of choosing how I celebrate my Judaism. And I make that connection between what is important to me and my movement at the time, and then what I think should be important for our country at the time as well.
If I could just follow a little on that, would an example of that be your how Judaism might influence your position on immigration?
So yes, as I would say yes and no on that question as well, though, because immigration in Judaism, like we were told in Torah to always love the stranger. We were strangers in Egypt, so we need to remember that. And we have that same background story. And so to be connected and to the immigrants in our country as well. So I would say that I am connected to that issue because of Judaism, not necessarily maybe the way I practice my Judaism. I think a good example of something I'm connected to in political issues because of the way I practice my Judaism is actually the topic we were just talking about, and LGBTQ issues. And just like you mentioned that there have been changes in officiation in your faith tradition, also in the Reform movement of Judaism, we allow the rabbis to decide if they'll perform an interfaith wedding. We allow the rabbis to decide and are completely open to performing same-sex marriages. And I think that would be one of the issues that, because of the way I practice my Judaism, I'm influenced in my thinking.
Good, thank you for that. Zoya, would you like to respond to the question of how your religion might have influenced a vote and your political approach to things?
Right. So as I mentioned earlier, Islam is a very active religion, and it's also a very practical religion. And a key element of our faith is, how do we exist in society? How do we build society and meaningful community? And the prophet, peace be upon him, he said, whoever sees an evil, let him change it with his hand. And if he's not able to do so, then with his tongue. And if he's still not able to do so, then with his heart. And so as Muslims, it is my belief that our absolute responsibility is to ensure that justice is met to the best of our ability. And so as a result, being engaged in the political process is a means to ensure justice as much as one can achieve through political institutions. And right, so in university, I studied political science. I have a degree in political science. And so that also frames my perspective as well. And as someone who, right, calls myself a Muslim, and understand that that guides everything I do in my life, those things absolutely work together and must work together from my perspective to build a more meaningful community.
You don't need to answer this question, but I'll ask it anyway. Was this election your first presidential election in which you were able to vote?
It actually is not. This is my
Okay.
second presidential election.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. All right. Let's see. Let me have Joshua take that question of whether your religion influenced your vote and your politics.
Sure. The hope is that Buddhist practice influences our presentation in each moment of our lives, no matter how fantastical or aspirational that may be. And again, our chief practice is that of concentrated presence, attentiveness, pausing and paying deep attention. So that's something I certainly bring into my survey of political issues in my own civic life. But more specifically, what we hope arises from that concentrated presence, from our practice of meditation, is a sense of our inseparable unity as human beings, which points toward these notions of compassion, of loving kindness, and of caring well for one another. So certainly from that perspective, Buddhism influences my political engagement.
Emanuel, I'll ask you the same thing, and you can even use this to say something about the politics of your father if you want.
Well, I would say I grew up in the Christian tradition from the perspective, and not all Christians grow up with that, where social justice is really a part of who we are. The way I vote is rooted in my understanding of Christianity. I think of the scripture in Micah 6:8, what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. The other, which is the most influential when it comes to really how I look at politics and how I was raised, it comes from the New Testament Gospel of Luke, chapter 4. It was Jesus's first recorded sermon, where he's really making, it's the scroll of Isaiah that's unrolled, and it makes reference to the Jubilee laws that I came to set the captives free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And so that's really the approach I take, that when I'm looking at candidates, or really just in every aspect of life, throughout the Old Testament, I think the Rabbi shared this earlier, there was the constant talk in the Old Testament about taking care of the widows, the orphans, and the strangers. Jesus actually continues that same tradition. So it's hard to separate looking at that, even when I vote, from my faith tradition. On another hand, there is something out of the Christian tradition called Black liberation theology, which says that Jesus is on the side of the poor and identifies with the poor. There's even in the Gospel of Matthew said, what you do for the least of these, you do for me. So that's really the approach I take, not just in politics, but really in every aspect of life.
Good. Thank you for that. Mindy, I'm going to ask before we break into our discussion rooms, whether there are some questions in the chat that you'd like to throw at at some of our panelists.
There are. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everyone. Max asked a little while ago, he made a comment in a question, young people are trending to the growing non-affiliated category of religious affiliation. What do we make of this trend, and how do we see religion changing changing in our different traditions, maybe to grab hold of those young people?
This is certainly happening in Christianity and Judaism. Rabbi Sarah, do you want to jump in on that one briefly?
Yeah, it is so true. It is definitely happening in Judaism. I'd say the younger generation, but the generation I'm in also, like young parents, are gravitating to being unengaged in organized religious life. And I think that word engagement is what we're doing in Judaism. We are trying to figure out ways to engage the unengaged. How do you do that, though? It is such a challenge. And then look at the world we're living in now, where we have programs like this on Zoom, where we come together in virtual ways. And I think just like Judaism has been changing throughout the ages, one of the joys I love about Reform Judaism is we get to continue making those changes. And a lot of those changes right now are bringing Judaism to where the people are. For many faiths, especially for Judaism, it's not all about making sure people come to us, but we need to now learn how to go to them and make sure that we can make Judaism relevant to everyone's lives. And I feel like it's not necessarily just that younger generation and not necessarily just my generation of young parents, but I think that idea that maybe our parents and our grandparents had, that even if you don't participate, you need to belong to a synagogue in order to pay back whatever you thought, that idea doesn't necessarily exist anymore. And so there's a lot of unaffiliated people who are looking for program and engagement before they choose to actually join an organized religious group. And so I feel like we almost have to flip it the way we're doing things. We have to get the people to us and go to them before we make them commit completely to joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Emanuel, you and I are both Protestants, identify as Protestants, and 20 years ago, Protestants made up a majority of the American population. We are now down to something like 46% of the population. It's still a plurality, but what are you doing about all of that, and how do you view that slippage into the nuns?
Yeah, I think one, it has to be made relevant. It simply can't be recalling the stories that happened thousands of years ago, or quoting the poetry written thousands of years ago. It has to be presented in a way that people can relate to what's going on in their lives. And, that's sometimes a challenge, because, there are many traditionalists who say, who are opposed of presenting the gospel in a new and fresh way. The way I always say it is, it can be presented in a new way, but it's still the same gospel. I always make the example of the movie King Kong that was made in the 1930s. It was made with clay animation, which was the latest technology of the day. And then it was remade in the 1970s, and they didn't use clay animation. They used a robotic figure, and it was a blockbuster. Then it was made again in the 2000s, but they didn't use clay animation or a robotic figure. It was all digital, but the story remained the same. They just presented it in a new and fresh way. And I think that's something that the church, at least, has gotten away from. We want to present the gospel using clay animation when the entire world has moved beyond that and is now digital. So we're still presenting the gospel as if we live in a blockbuster world, but everyone else is on Netflix.
I've always liked the quote attributed, I think, to St. Francis of Assisi, which is, Preach the gospel always. When necessary, use words. Zoya, if there is that kind of slippage of membership, of attachment to Islam, similar to what's happening in Judaism and Christianity, I'm not quite aware of it. What's your view of that?
So it's certainly a little complicated. I think one thing that's really important to recognize is that out of all of the Muslims in the United States, right, 75%, if you will, are a lot of first generation immigrants, people who have reverted to the religion, but 25% of the religion is actually rooted in the Black community in America, right? And so in the 70s, 60s, right, was a huge wave of folks who identified as Muslim and started living that as their truth. And so the Muslim community is very diverse. And it's very complicated, and there's not a ton of data out there. But from my perspective, there are two elements, right? There's one, what the Muslim community is experiencing internally with our mosques and our youth groups, things like that, which are certainly growing. But one thing that I think would be appropriate for me to address right now is what Muslim youth experience as a minority in the United States. And I feel obligated to address this, unfortunately, because there's a dialogue, if you will, happening in the chat right now about Islam. And so one thing, unfortunately, is that recent research shows that over 70% of Muslim youth experience bullying based on their faith. And as a result, a lot of young Muslims have a hard time publicly associating with their faith, right? Out of fear of ostracization, violence, bullying, whatever it may be. There is a ton of misinformation about Muslims, which is for many people impacting their relationship with their own faith. And so this, trying to find the best words, this false association of Islam with violence, with all these terrible things, is really hurting a lot of people who are trying to explore their own personal relationship with their faith. And if we do not break down these misconceptions as folks who hold misconceptions, because I want to make something very clear, is that from my perspective, it is not the obligation of a Muslim, it is not my obligation to prove to you that I am a kind human being that deserves humanity, right? And so that's something that we have to engage in when we're having these dialogues, is that when we have conversations, they have to be meaningful. Yes, have questions, ask them, please, but in a meaningful way that encourages understanding, not in a way that makes someone feel othered or disrespected.
My Lutheran pastor friend, David Nelson, says we should ask appreciative questions that take into account where someone else is. Mindy, it is about time for us to go into our breakout rooms. I wonder whether you want to say a word about that before that happens.
I will. I'll also let people know that I felt very challenged after the deaths of Dad and Reet and Terry to go into the work of interfaith. And in 2014, I didn't know the word interfaith existed. I had no idea what interfaith was. And so I have learned a lot, and I have stumbled significantly, and I have been around Muslims and Hindu and Jewish people that I didn't understand their traditions before. And I start a conversation with humility, and I usually start a conversation where I might feel like I'm going to make a mistake by saying, I might make a mistake. I don't want to offend you. I am curious. Could we have a conversation about this, and could you allow me some time to ask questions? So that's how I have done it, and I would recommend that if you have an opportunity to have a one-on-one Zoom or a one-on-one coffee with someone, it gives you the opportunity, if you want to ask questions, to do that. Just enter the conversation in that way of curiosity, rather than with I think many of you on the call are going to do that now, but if you know someone who wants to do that, you don't want them to go into it with fear and trepidation. Just go into it with, you might make mistakes, and let people know that. And I want to thank our panelists. I think I pushed everybody off to Bill to get the panel started, and I didn't get to show you your lovely slide that shows your pictures and your names. So there are lovely panelists. Thank you all very much. And you know what, one act of kindness, a lot of the 2 rooms I went in, people were talking about acts of kindness. I'm going to slow down because Barnett said I was talking too fast. So acts of kindness are, you could send a thank you note directly to each of these people. And Bill Tammeus, you could do a handwritten old-fashioned thank you note. And I don't know, Zoya, if you have like a PO box or something where someone could send something, but I know Dr. Joshua, it could go to the Buddhist Center and Rabbi Smiley. It could go to B'nai Yehuda, Temple B'nai Yehuda, and Emanuel Cleaver, Reverend Emanuel Cleaver. It could go to St. James United Methodist Church. If you can't find their address and you want to send them a thank you note, you can send it to Faith Always Wins. Our address is on our website. So we have presented Leaning on Our Faith for Inspiration and Hope. And I did put the survey in the chat, but a lot of people exited. So you're going to get an email from me that's going to have the survey link in it, with me begging you to please answer. I think we did 3 questions in our survey, but we are trying to measure how well these experiences go. And I want to remind you that we did not have a sponsor for tonight, but if you wanted to sponsor, you could sponsor next time. We think we're going to do this again in February, but that's part of what the survey is for, is to find out. Today marks the beginning of our 30 days of kindness. So again, Church of the Resurrection had their days of kindness. I know other congregations have had days of kindness, and now Faith Always Wins is going to try to keep this going for our community. And if you want to help Faith Always Wins continue to operate year-round, there are a variety of ways. A really fun way to help us is just to purchase a kind t-shirt for you. One of our kindness shirts has themes. I'm showing you the Others Day theme because we were all talking about treating the other more nicely. So that could be a great holiday gift of any kind, any type of holiday gift to someone. And then we just want to thank you so much. We have now presented our Leaning on Our Faith, Hope and Inspiration. And Bill, I would mention to you and see if you have any closing remarks, because I would say Barnett asked a question, what about God in everyday, historically, the bad things that happen? How do people keep their faith after bad things happen? I'd kind of like to end on that. And then I also asked you, Bill, to ask our panelists to give us one action of hope and inspiration.
Okay. The question that was asked about when bad things happen, theologians have been wrestling with that one for centuries. It's called the old theodicy question, which is why is there evil and suffering in the world if God is good and all powerful and loving? My answer to that is that we don't have an exhaustive answer to that. That is in effect the open wound of religion. If anyone on the panel has a better answer than that, speak now.
I have one.
Okay.
So, and I'm of course going to give you in the light of my faith, the answer to that is given because it's not a punishment, it's a test. It comes as a test when you face diversity bigger than your level of understanding. It just changes, metamorphosizes in you a chemical change that brings you up to that challenge before you even know it. Mindy is a living example of that, and I can bring hundreds of other examples that I know personally. You just see those changes in people and how they transform not only themselves, which they didn't know they were up to that, how they transform others with that challenge that they have faced. But God puts it up to them as a test. It's not a punishment. Now, why that test is given to those few people, I don't have an answer to that. Sorry. Even prophets and saints go through that test.
Darn, that's the answer I was hoping for. Thank you for that.
Bill, if I might,
Yeah,
I think I'd be doing a disservice if I didn't offer a Buddhist perspective on theodicy.
Okay.
And, for us, of course, we're not dealing with theology. So, we're the fourth largest world religion that doesn't necessarily have the concept of a deity manipulating our day-to-day life. So it's an interesting thing when we have these conversations to see how does this stack up. And for a Buddhist, particular difficult challenges sometimes are mocked up to karma, which can be an abacus in the sky. But it can also just be, wow, causes and conditions that are beyond my control have rendered me in this situation. And my practice demands that I show up with sincerity and with resolute attentiveness and power through. So there are alternative perspectives that aren't dealing with theology in that way, but common human suffering.
Yeah, thank you, Joshua, for that. As we close, I wonder, I would like each of our four panelists to give us one actionable step that each of us could take in the coming weeks to try to achieve what we've been talking about tonight, which is a more kind and just world. Joshua, you were just speaking. Give us, come back on and give us one thing we can do in the next week or two.
Sure. The Buddhist prescription is just this: sit down, quiet down, and pay attention. We don't offer ourselves that opportunity very often. It's go, go, go mode. So just take a break, sit down, settle down, pay attention.
Okay. Emanuel, Cleaver.
I would say be intentional. Intentionally try to connect with someone who comes from a different tradition or culture than your own.
Great, thank you. Zoya?
Something that I've been doing is reaching out to folks in my life that I may have not spoken with in a while, and just trying to reconnect. I think it's easy to say you're staying in touch with someone because you're a friend on Facebook or you follow them on Instagram, but take some time to reconnect with the people in your life and share your appreciation. I know seeing so many faces I haven't seen in a while. One of my former teachers, Annie Riggs, I'm so grateful to see you here today. So it's just a good reminder to myself to check in with people who have impacted your life.
You remind me I haven't spoken to your mother in too long, so I need to reconnect with Sophia. Sarah?
I would agree with what everyone said. And I think what I would add would be Judaism teaches that we don't have to complete all the work, but we're supposed to do something. So it's not up to us to fix all the injustice in the world. It's not up to us to make everyone a kinder person, but it's up to us to do something. And I think if we can go into the next few weeks thinking in that mindset that I don't have to do everything at once, that I can figure out one way, one new person to reach out to. Living in this COVID-19 time, which we haven't really talked about much tonight, though, there are so many people who feel isolated that aren't making those connections or don't have the abilities to make those connections. So I think now even more important to do what everyone else has said, that idea of reaching out to people who we haven't talked to in a while, or reaching out to someone that maybe you know, but you haven't had a true conversation with them because maybe they have some kind of difference with you, and learn about that difference. So I think it's so important to reach out to people, especially in this isolating time, and remember that we don't have to heal the world in one step. We can take baby steps.
Joshua, you were just asked to repeat. Thank you, Sarah. Joshua, you were just asked to repeat something.
I think that one was sit down, settle down, and pay attention, perhaps.
Yeah. Okay. I would add one more actionable thing for all of you, and that is the last chapter in my next book, which is to be published January 19th, lists at least 8 ideas for how we can combat religious extremism in the world and what we can do about it. And just so you know, Mindy has written the afterword for the book, and it'll be available in a few weeks on Amazon and various places. But I would direct you to those 8 different ideas for how you can be engaged in helping to fix what is wrong in the world of religion. And Mindy, it's back to you to wrap it up.
Thank you. I was busy posting the survey link in the chat since we have so much going on in the chat. I am very appreciative. I have to tell you, I was anxious today when our numbers started getting really high, and I was concerned about the breakout rooms, and I had told myself that I was going to be very relaxed and not anxious, because I've been so anxious this last year. Our own son, Lucas, was a COVID-19 2020 high school graduate. So he didn't have any of his last semester of high school like normally people would have. And now he's a COVID freshman in college. And so we're going through all the ups and downs of that in our life. And then of course we all have the election and are still having the election, so to speak. So your answers in the survey are really important. It helps us understand what to do better next time. And I love our panelists. Thank you so much. I'm really glad. We were very confident and careful about choosing male and female. And we also chose different age categories, and then of course different faiths, but that's what we do. Again, I was really challenged, very challenged, not just because of the murders of my dad and son and Terry, but I was challenged by God to bring my people together. And I struggled with what that meant. And I started learning about Judaism first, and then I learned about Islam next, and then Hinduism, and then Buddhism, and I started learning more. And I'll tell you now what I'm also doing on a personal level is I've created a group of 8 Black women and 8 white women, and we have a conversation once a month. The first book that we read together was Small Great Things by Jodi Picoult. And we did a little book study, and then someone posted a meme that said, what happens when racism gets talked about? White women join a book club. And I just was like, great, that's what I did. As a white woman, I didn't know what to do, and we ended up forming a book club. But we've met now since May, and now we're reading How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, which is really heavy and a little hard to read through on and on. And so we're taking a break in November. Our meeting is November 18th. And we're going to talk about female fun stuff. I'm not exactly sure. Maybe we're all going to drink wine for an hour. I'm not really sure. And then we're going to re-engage. But that's my other thing. I mean, find like this, if you joined this, find something that resonates with you that brings you peace. I heard someone in a breakout room talk about how wonderful it was to see our panelists so filled with peace. So you panelists have so much peace, it exudes through the screen and people can feel your peace. And so thank you so much for that. Bill, thank you. Everyone, please, when Bill's book is available, you're gonna want to buy it, not just to read his, but to read my afterword. You wanna read what I wrote about Bill too. Anyway, I'm joking. Have a wonderful holiday, whatever your holiday is coming up. I would think most of us celebrate Thanksgiving. And so whatever that looks like for you, that's a Zoom Thanksgiving or you're getting together with people. So good luck with that. And there are people on here who have COVID, people who are in a long haul. Why don't you say a prayer for those people as well who are in a long haul with COVID? That would be appreciated. Okay, everybody have a great night.
Thanks. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.